Hi guys, I think it's fair to say we love American independent cinema. And I feel in recent years there hasn't been enough that's genuinely independent. You get a lot of films that sort of have all the kind of stylistic devices and the right casting and a shot with that sort of almost identikit kind of indie sensibility. But rarely do you get something that's genuinely sort of self-financed, original, made on its own terms without studio influence. But this film is one of those things. This is a review of Thunder Road, a feature film by Jim Cummings. This film was made for $190,000. It was crowdfunded, and Jim Cummings stars in it, he writes it, he directs it, and right down at the end, if you look at the credit roll, he also edits it and does some of the music. It's based on a short film that he made, which was a single shot of a police officer performing a curious dance to Bruce Springsteen's Thunder Road at his mother's funeral. And this movie starts with essentially the same scene, but his CD player, his daughter's CD player, doesn't actually work, so it becomes a muted, strange, slightly comic, tragicomic kind of performance. And the reason I'm sort of starting with how it starts is that first shot is held for a good sort of, I think, 6 to 8 minutes. So it's really harking back to the short film that Jim Cummings made. So it's about a cop called Jim. He's on the right side of the law. We find him, as I say, at the funeral of his mum's. And this curiously contorted, tragic, pathos-ridden kind of moment happens where he's sort of dancing and falling apart and laughing and all this stuff is going on in front of his mother's coffin. In that first sort of 6 to 7, 8 minutes, you get a real sense of, in microcosm, what the entire film's about, which is really a portrait of this man as he deals with the everyday stuff that comes at normal human beings in life. He's split from his partner, he has a daughter, he's trying to seek access, he wants shared custody. His mum's died. He's also a cop who's been decorated, but he's under stress. We discover quite early on that he suffers from dyslexia, and I think that's a really neat little detail that he parks in there, because his character, and I'd be fascinated to know if Jim Cummings, the man who plays him, is like this at all in real life, is incredibly fidgety, agitated. You feel that there's all sorts of things like dyslexia, ADHD, OCD going on. He's incredibly meticulous. He's quite sort of concentrated and sort of quite almost maniacal in his focus, but he's only just holding it together. And so within this opening scene, you see him trying and struggling to play his daughter's pink CD Ghetto Blaster. I used to have exactly the same one. It was a Barbie one for Izzy, my eldest girl, and it doesn't play. And so there's this kind of, there's this sort of flawed element to everything that he tries to do. Everything he almost touches falls apart because he's trying so hard. And then we quite quickly get into the details of his relationship with his daughter, and this was the most sort of emotionally affecting part of the film for me, because it really resonated for me in terms of my eldest child. And it's fraught, it's a fraught, it's emotionally laden, it's emotionally complicated, not just for the dad, obviously, it's really emotionally complicated for the daughter. And so we see a number of scenes where he's trying to set up home for his daughter, and she comes over and she visits, and we see this exchange between him and his ex-wife where he kind of infers that he'd quite like her to be hit by a train. He doesn't mean it, but there's that sort of chat that happens between couples who've split up. These scenes are very real. They're very sort of almost unscripted but scripted, and you feel that he's just sort of he's just running at the situation rather than following a script. And then, of course, you have this sort of slightly tragic relationship with his daughter. And his daughter, understandably, and I really understood this, and this was really very real and I felt this very keenly. His daughter kind of is there at his place, but is resistant and doesn't really want to be there. Not necessarily because she doesn't love him, but because she doesn't want to be coming from split homes. He's made a lovely bed for her. She'd rather have her old bed. And you can feel his frustration and his sadness and his awkwardness and his desire to make it perfect. And in his desire to make it perfect, he's sort of overcompensating and he's making it worse, and he's focusing on her too much. So we have this sort of really quite stressful relationship between him and his daughter, which is beautifully observed, really well played by the young girl. And and you can feel her sort of awkwardness, and they just park some of the thoughts that maybe she's a bit troublesome in her own behaviour and a bit lippy, a bit cheeky, and all that kind of stuff from a broken home. We then see Jim at work, and we get a really keen and quick sense that his boss is kind of already cutting him some slack, and they all feel that because his mum's died, and he's dealing with it badly, that he needs to take time off work. He doesn't want to take time off work. He wants to keep sort of ploughing on with his job, and he starts to aggravate his boss and essentially put his job on the line a bit. We also establish his friend Nate, who's his buddy, his partner, and this is a really nicely drawn friendship again. It reminded me differently, but it reminded me at times of the relationship between Jake Gyllenhaal and Michael Pena in End of Watch. I really like these films, and cop films and that sort of partnership between two policemen really allows for quite unique observations about male friendship or male companionship and male intimacy in a way, and I really like that. And although he's a cop, this film really successfully shows the thin line between sort of being notionally a successful member of society, but also that sense that life is always tipping on the edge of an abyss. I mean, he's a law enforcer, he observes the law, he enacts the law, and yet at the same time his partner, or his ex-partner, the mother of his daughter, clearly is flirting around the edges of a druggy lifestyle. You feel that Jim's life is kind of hanging by a thread. It's a bit ramshackle at the edges. It's a bit fragile, a bit fraught. It's a bit shaky. And yet, so, he has this badge of honour. He's even a decorated policeman, but at the same time, just burgeoning and bubbling beneath the surface is this sense of he could lose everything, or everything is about to be thrown away, and you're sort of, that's a really stressful dynamic across the film, because you feel his stress of his personality, but it also stresses you out. So I found the watch, it's 90 minutes long, I found the watch quite it made me feel really anxious. There's a lot of anxiety in this film, and that's mainly down to his agitated, fidgety face and persona, and when he engages with people, he's constantly feeling self-pity. He's always feeling that he's done something wrong, and at first, there are times where you're sympathetic and you feel for him, and then there are other times where you get a bit kind of frustrated with him, and you think, well, no wonder people are holding you at arm's length. They can't do right for doing wrong, and so you have, it's not just a sort of I've seen a couple of reviews that suggest that we're just made to feel and see the world from his perspective and feel for him. I don't think you do. I think at times you get really alienated by him, and you want to slap him, and you want to sort of pull him around. And there's a really, really specific moment where you really feel that, which is when he goes into the school to meet the teacher of his daughter, and basically he's being told that she's disruptive in class, she's being difficult, her behaviour's wrong, she's been using really kind of colourful sexual language, and we see Jim go from trying to explain that he's not wholly responsible for her childcare, and that must be coming from his mum, and then there's a moment where the teacher infers that she's got learning difficulties, and he feels a huge crushing responsibility because of his dyslexia, and he quite literally grabs the table that he's holding, stands up, and you think, a moment of extreme uncontrollable violence is going to happen. This kind of put me in mind of some of the characters that you got in films by Scorsese, Paul Schrader, the sort of mean streets, Paul Schrader's Blue Collar, even Paul Schrader's recent film First Reformed with Ethan Hawke playing the priest. This is very much one man's self-flagellating journey through not feeling like he can be a perfect dad, be a perfect cop, be a perfect son even to his dead mum. It's a film where the lead male character cries an awful lot throughout the film. And at times I was thinking, I wonder if this would really alienate people, because he grates a bit in the end on me. He grated, and you sort of thought, come on, stop this. But at the same time, it felt very real. So to have a kind of character or a personality presented in that way, where you're allowed to not like bits of them and like other bits of them, that's quite a complicated thing in a film to allow an audience to do, because usually you're told this is the person you're not going to like, or this is what you're going to like about this person, i.e. he's there for the humour. It's being billed as a comedy, and there are some very funny moments in it, but for me, all the humour in this film is absolutely shot through with an incredibly dark and sort of quite depressing portrait of an everyday life ricocheting against the edges of not much money, not much opportunity, not many choices. And that's even as a cop. I don't want to ruin what happens in the film. I mean, put it this way, his life spirals, the uncontrollability spirals, it gets more complicated between him and his ex and his access to his daughter. There are a couple of scenes where he has to go to court, very moving scene. I mean, there was a couple of moments, like there's a moment in the court where I just felt like his struggle for shared custody of his daughter. He was a decorated cop. There's the inference performance that his behaviour at the funeral was seen as violent. I don't know, it felt a bit creaky narratively there. Let me know what you think if you see the film. But by and large, I thought, there were a series of moments in this guy's life that really all added together to give you a sense of a man desperately trying to find his purpose or do right, but at the same time constantly snagged by his own self-loathing and his own inability to control his sort of slightly ADHD behaviour. But there's one moment where he's particularly down on his luck and he's having a bad time, and his friend Nate, played by Nican Robinson from 13 Reasons Why, brilliant performance there, brilliant drawing of a male friendship there. Anyway, he comes around to visit him. Jim has smashed up his place, he's drinking too much. But there's a moment where his friend Nate calls his wife at home, just sort of aside so that Jim can't hear him, and just says to her, "God, I love you," because he's so sort of frightened that the life and the uncontrollability that's going on around Jim doesn't infect him. He also must feel that, life, the security of life is hanging by a thread. It's on a knife edge. It can tip one way or the other that easily. And for me, I thought that was one of the most telling moments, was where his friend, Jim's friend, his partner, Nate, calls home and says, "God, I love you," to his wife, because he's just seeing the carnage, the chaos, the play out of mess in this guy's, Jim's life. Jim Cummings, the director and actor, says he channeled David Brent and Alan Partridge for some of this performance. And I don't know why, that didn't really add anything to it for me. I mean, I've seen a few reviewers comment on it saying it is very funny. There are lots of moments of extraordinary awkwardness where his social ineptitude is really what's, key to the scene. But all of it for me, I just kept, I don't know, it's the empath in me, I just kept wanting to sort of reach out and either shake him or hug him or hold him or no, don't do that or don't do this. And although there are creaky, extraordinarily embarrassing moments where he overstays his welcome or says the wrong thing, or you feel his awkwardness. I mean, his awkwardness in himself, his awkwardness with life, I think will relate to most people who've ever felt awkward about who they are or what they are. And I thought that was very well drawn. But for me, although, you might read in places this is a comedy, it's a dark comedy, there are comic moments in it, but for me it really is a tragicomedy. Jim Cummings definitely manages to pull off a sort of searingly honest portrait of a man on the edge, fidgeting with within his limitations, struggling at playing all these roles, trying to be father, trying to be son, maintaining the law, the idea that he's a law enforcer, and yet there's a sort of lawlessness at work in his relationships and in his life. He goes to visit his sister. It's, that's a contorted and twisted and estranged relationship. They talk about maybe phoning each other in the next year, and you feel that he's reaching for connection, he's reaching to belong, he wants ownership or something. And I don't want to sort of give away what actually happens at the end of the film. On one level, it's a very sort of cheesy ending, but at the same time, it's delivered in a very real way, because you're left again with this sense of smiling and laughter, but you're also left with this sense of deep sadness and loss, because, it works out in some ways, but it doesn't work out in other ways. And that I think is the charm of the film. And of course, there's one other moment, which is also in the trailer, where he completely loses the plot in the car parking lot of where he works at the police station. Completely loses the plot, and again that just sort of hammered home that sort of Scorsese Schrader, this lone man struggling with what it means to be a man, losing it, literally losing the shirt off his back. He's being stripped of his status, his state, being stripped of his status, his identity, his purpose. And there are moments in this where you think, oh my God, what is going to happen? What is going to happen? He's going to literally fall into the abyss of what? If he loses his job, if he loses his kid, where can this go? And of course, with any film, I think one reviewer, Mark Commode, said, this is a flawed work, but well, yes, of course, all films, the best films aren't perfect. The best films are those that have cracks in them, that throw up all sorts of kind of other issues. But for me, the greatest achievement in this film, forgetting the film itself, is the way in which Jim Cummings' force of nature, in a sense, has just made it happen. And for that, I think this film deserves everyone's attention. I really want everyone who if you want to see a brilliant performance, and if you want to take just the comedy from it, you can, but I promise you'll be touched in many, many more ways. Just moments like, and I think it's in the trailer, the scene where he's trying to do the clap hand thing with his daughter. I remember trying to do that countless times with every one of my daughters, and I could never do them. And the way in which at a certain point in the film he's gone off to learn and get it right That for me was a priceless moment of a father trying to be a great father to his daughter and only knowing how to do it in a certain limited number of ways. This is a beautiful film about fatherhood, about the fears of fatherhood. It's a beautiful film about, it's a challenging film about the knife edge that everyone's lives sit on if just a few components in your life suddenly sit out of sync with each other. It's a tender portrait of a friendship under pressure between him and Nate, and yet there's a closeness there. So you see that moment between two men trying to reach out to each other. They are hugging each other. And it's also a film in which you see a man cry a lot. Now you could say, oh God, a crying man, blah, 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 blah. But I think that in itself is quite brave. This is brave filmmaking. This is bravura filmmaking. He keeps it clipped in at 90 minutes, which is always good. He doesn't get too self-indulgent, which is dangerous when you're filming it, editing it, writing it, doing the music, and you're in it. He knows, and he occupies centre stage for most of the film, but you don't feel like this is a sort of egotistical sort of hymn fest. It's not a Jim fest. Jim Cummings isn't the star of the piece, and yet he is the star of the piece. And I would also hazard to say that it's that agitative thing of his personality and all the stuff that must have gone into getting this film made that probably added to that slightly sort of multi-personality schizophrenic element to the character in the film. This is a great film. Go and see it. Find those few screenings where it's on in the country and go and check it out.
For more film and family fun, don't forget to click the subscribe button and make sure to click the bell to never miss an update.